The cold that settled over Black Ridge that January was not the ordinary kind. It was the kind of cold that had a personality, mean, stubborn, the sort that crept under barn doors and through the gaps in log walls no matter how much mud and straw you packed in. It froze the horse troughs solid by nightfall and cracked the wooden handles of axes left outdoors before dawn. The sky stayed the color of old ash for weeks, and the wind moved through the pines with a sound like something grieving. Most people stayed indoors when they could. They huddled near their stoves, drank their coffee black and scalding, and waited for February like a sentence they had no choice but to serve. The town of Black Ridge was not a soft place even in summer. In January it became something closer to a test, of will, of warmth, of how long a person could go without something kind happening to them. Rowan Hale had stopped expecting kindness some time ago. He rode into town that morning because he needed feed grain and a new axle pin for his wagon. Nothing more, nothing less. He had no interest in conversation, no patience for the idle gossip that collected like dust in Calloway's general store, and absolutely no desire to stand in the open cold any longer than necessary. He had ridden 8 miles through frozen terrain with his collar up and his jaw set, and his plan was simple: get what he came for, load it onto the horse, and ride back to the ranch before noon. Rowan was 34 years old and looked closer to 40. Not from weakness. He was built like a man who had spent his entire adult life doing physical labor, wide through the shoulders, rough in the hands, with the kind of physical endurance that came from necessity rather than pride. But there was something in his face that had aged him ahead of his years, a flatness in his eyes, a way he had of looking at things without really seeing them, as though the world had become a series of objects to be managed rather than experienced. People in Black Ridge mostly left him alone, which suited him fine. He had come to the territory 4 years prior with his wife, Catherine, and the hope of building something. The ranch had been their shared dream, 70 acres of good grazing land in the foothills, a creek that ran clear even in dry seasons, timber for expansion. They had worked themselves hollow, getting the first structures up, had laughed while doing it, had talked about the children they would raise there, the life they would grow slowly and with intention. Catherine had died 18 months ago, in childbirth, along with the infant daughter who never drew a first breath. Rowan had buried them both on the hillside behind the barn, under a pine tree that was older than the territory itself. He visited the grave every morning. He didn't pray. He just stood there, as though proximity was its own kind of language, as though being near them was the only conversation he had left that mattered. Since then, he had kept the ranch running through sheer stubbornness. He had 2 hands who helped: old Marcus Webb, who was 61 and moved slowly but knew cattle, the way most men knew their own reflections, and a younger man named Pete Doyle, who was 22 and more enthusiastic than skilled but willing to learn. The 3 of them ran the ranch with efficiency and very little warmth. Meals were functional, evenings were quiet. No one talked about anything that wasn't directly related to the work. It was a life. Rowan would not have called it living. He tied his horse outside Calloway's and stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, stomping snow from his boots, and that was when he heard the crowd. It was not a large crowd. Black Ridge had perhaps 400 souls at that time, and most of them were sensible enough to be elsewhere. But there were perhaps 60 people gathered in the open square between the store and the sheriff's office, unusual enough in January that Rowan paused, his hand still on his horse's neck. He heard Gideon Mercer before he saw him. That voice was unmistakable, low and carrying with a self-assurance that bordered on contempt, the voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to wonder whether people were listening. Gideon Mercer was 58 years old and had spent the last 2 decades turning timber money into land holdings into political influence, and political influence into a kind of small-town sovereignty that he wore as naturally as his tailored wool coat. He owned the largest mill in the county. He had placed 2 men on the territorial council. When Gideon Mercer spoke in a public square, people did not leave. They didn't necessarily agree, but they stayed. Rowan hesitated, then moved toward the edge of the crowd because something in the quality of the silence bothered him. It was not the silence of boredom or patience. It was the silence of people who were uncomfortable and doing nothing about it. A different animal entirely. He pushed to the outer edge and found a gap between 2 men who smelled of wood smoke and looked at the ground. What he saw stopped him cold. Gideon Mercer stood in the center of the square like he owned it, which in practical terms he nearly did. He was dressed well for the weather, heavy coat, good boots, a hat that cost more than most families in that crowd spent on food in a month. His beard was trimmed, his posture imperial. Beside him stood a man Rowan didn't recognize, short and thin with the look of a lawyer or an accountant, someone whose job was to write things down and make them official. Behind Gideon, slightly apart from him, and very clearly not there by choice, stood a woman and 6 children. The woman was perhaps 30, though the circumstances made it difficult to be certain. She was thin, not the healthy lean of hard work, but the drawn, angular thinness of prolonged hunger. Her dress was inadequate for the temperature, covered by a shawl that had been mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric. She stood very straight, which Rowan would later understand was not defiance, but the last dignified thing she had left, the one posture she could still control. Her face was hard to read. Not blank, there was too much going on behind her eyes for that, but carefully controlled in the way of someone who has learned, through experience, that visible emotion is a liability. The children ranged from what looked like 14 or 15 down to a small girl who could not have been older than 4. They were arranged in a loose cluster behind their mother, the older ones unconsciously positioning themselves between the younger and Gideon, a protective instinct that looked so practiced it had become automatic. They were all cold. The older children, 3 boys, 2 girls in the middle range, wore coats of varying adequacy. Worn through at the elbows, too small in some cases, but there. The youngest girl, the tiny one at the end, had no coat at all. She had no shoes. She stood in the packed snow in bare feet, holding the hem of her dress with both hands, and she was trying very hard not to cry. Rowan stared at her for a long moment. Then he made himself look at Gideon. "Matter of simple accounting," Gideon was saying, his voice carrying easily over the still air. He spoke with the casual authority of a man explaining something obvious to people slower than himself. "My son, God rest him, left debts. Significant debts owed to me and to the mill. The widow and her children have occupied my property, mark you, for the better part of a year, consuming resources, providing nothing of value in return." He paused and looked around the crowd with an expression of tired patience. "I am a reasonable man. I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to resolve a practical problem." A practical problem. The word sat in the cold air with a particular kind of ugliness. "What he means," said a man near Rowan, his voice too low to carry, "is he wants rid of them without looking like he threw them into a snowdrift." "Same thing," the man beside him muttered. Gideon continued. He explained in his careful, businesslike way that the debt his late son had accumulated totaled $412. He had no interest in pursuing the widow legally. Again, reasonable man, no desire to punish. But neither could he be expected to absorb the cost indefinitely. He was therefore offering the family, all 7 of them, to any man in Black Ridge willing to settle the debt and take them on. "The woman is capable," he said, with the detached assessment of a livestock dealer. "Strong. She can work a household. The older boys are useful in the field. I can vouch for that personally. They've worked my mill. The girls are old enough to be helpful around a house. The little one—" He glanced briefly at the barefoot child with the expression of a man acknowledging a minor inconvenience. "She'll grow." No one spoke. The crowd stood in its collective discomfort, and no one spoke. And the little girl stood in the snow with no shoes, and no one moved. Rowan had been still through all of this. He stood at the edge of the crowd with his hands in his coat pockets, watching, with the expression of a man who had not yet decided whether this was his business or not. He looked at the woman, Eliza, he would learn her name was Eliza, and saw her watching the crowd with an expression he recognized because he had worn it himself, standing at 2 graves on a cold hillside. It was the expression of someone who has been through enough hard things that they no longer expect the world to be otherwise, who has let go of the version of events where someone steps forward, who is already calculating the next bad outcome and how to survive it. Then he looked at the little girl again. She had shifted her weight from one bare foot to the other, and the snow was red where she'd been standing. Her feet were bleeding. Rowan stood there for another 3 seconds. He would later be unable to account for what happened in those 3 seconds, whether it was something rational, some calculation of decency and capacity, or whether it was something older and less explainable. He would say, when anyone asked, that he didn't decide anything. He would say it felt more like remembering something he'd already decided a long time ago and forgotten until that moment. He pushed through the crowd. What? I'll take them. The words came out flat and matter-of-fact, the way he would have said, I'll take the grain or I'll take that axle pin. He was standing 10 feet from Gideon Mercer, and every pair of eyes in the crowd had turned to him, and he was already aware that he was going to be asked to explain himself, and he had nothing in particular to say. Gideon turned. He looked at Rowan with a careful, measuring expression. Hale. Mercer. A pause. You understand what I'm asking. $412, Rowan said. I can wire the amount to your mill account by end of week. My credit's good at the bank. You can verify that. A ripple went through the crowd. Not enthusiasm, more like the sound of 60 people recalibrating something all at once. Gideon's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. You're a single man, Hale. You have a ranch to run. What possible use? That's my business. Rowan looked past him, at Eliza. She was staring at him with an expression that was impossible to read. Not gratitude, not relief, something more complicated and more guarded than either. Ma'am, my name is Rowan Hale. I have a ranch about 8 miles north, in the foothills. It's not a fine place, but it's warm and there's food, and I'm not in the business of working anyone against their will. He paused, because he was not a practiced speaker and the sentence had come out longer than he intended. You don't have to come, but if you want to, the offer stands. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. She looked at her children. The youngest, the barefoot girl, had pressed herself against her mother's leg and was looking up at Rowan with huge, solemn eyes. Eliza looked back at Rowan. Something shifted in her face. Not softness, exactly. More like a door that had been locked from the inside for so long that the person inside had almost forgotten there was a door. What are your conditions? She said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, and direct. No trembling in it. Whatever fear she was feeling, it was not going into her voice. No conditions, he said. She almost laughed. It wasn't a kind sound. Every man has conditions, Mr. Hale. Then the condition is this. You and your children are guests on my land until you decide otherwise. You work if you want to work. You leave if you want to leave. My ranch hands are good men, and they'll treat you decently. That's all I've got. Gideon made a sound that might have been a chuckle and might have been something else. Touching sentiment, Hale, but the paperwork, have your man draw it up, Rowan said, without looking at him. I'll sign whatever clears the debt legally. The family comes with me. It took 40 minutes to complete the legal formality. Gideon's thin man produced papers from somewhere inside his coat, forms that Rowan signed with a borrowed pen while the crowd gradually dispersed, the entertainment apparently concluded. Rowan noticed that several people made a point of not looking at him as they left, which he took as a sign that they found the whole business uncomfortable and had decided that discomfort was equivalent to innocence. I went into Callaway's and bought 3 pairs of children's wool socks and the smallest boots they had in stock, which were a size too large, and brought them back to where Eliza and the children were waiting beside his horse. He crouched down in the snow and held the boots out to the little girl. She stared at them. She looked up at her mother. Eliza gave the smallest possible nod. The girl took the boots and sat down in the snow right where she was and put them on with an efficiency that suggested she had dressed herself for a long time. She looked up at Rowan when she was done. Her feet were still bleeding, the socks already showing a faint pink at the heel, but she had a look on her face like she was trying to decide something. They're too big, she said. I know. We'll get better ones. My name is Hattie. Rowan. She considered him. You talk funny. Hattie, Eliza said, quiet and firm. It's all right. Rowan stood. He looked at the whole family, 6 children and a woman, watching him with varying degrees of suspicion, uncertainty, and exhausted wariness. The oldest boy, who he'd later learn was Thomas, nearly 15, was watching him with eyes that had already decided not to trust anyone and were simply waiting for confirmation. My wagon's at the stable, Rowan said. It's a long, cold ride. If anyone's hungry, Callaway's keeps bread and salt pork behind the counter. He walked to the store without waiting to see if they followed. They followed. The ride back to the ranch took nearly 2 hours, the wagon loaded with feed grain and 7 passengers, and the weight of every unanswered question anyone in that vehicle was carrying. Rowan drove. Eliza sat on the bench beside him, slightly apart, her back straight and her eyes on the road. The children piled into the wagon bed with the grain sacks, the younger ones quickly burrowing into the hay that Rowan kept under a canvas tarp for exactly this kind of weather. Nobody talked for the first mile. Then Hattie, who had apparently decided the silence was wasteful, crawled up behind the bench and announced, "Thomas said you're going to make us work in a mine." "Hattie," Thomas's voice from the back, was mortified. "I don't own a mine," Rowan said. "That's what I told him." "You didn't tell me anything," Thomas said. "I didn't say mine. I said—" "He said you probably had something," the girl next to Thomas said, helpfully. This was Clara, 11, with her mother's careful eyes. "Something you needed people for." "I have cattle," Rowan said, "and a ranch that's been running on 3 people since last fall, which is about 2 people short of comfortable. There's always work on a cattle operation. Nobody's going to force you into it." Silence from the back. "What happened to your other people?" Thomas asked, after a moment. The question was not friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the question of someone doing a risk assessment. Rowan kept his eyes on the road. "My wife died. My ranch hands are still there. I just don't have a household." More silence. He could feel Eliza beside him, very still. "I'm sorry," she said finally. The words were simple and offered without embellishment, the way someone offers condolence when they know how little words can actually do. "Thank you," he said, equally plain. They didn't speak again for another mile. Then Hattie, who had remained wedged between them on the bench with complete territorial confidence, said, "Are you sad all the time or just sometimes?" "Hattie," Eliza said, "I'm asking." Rowan thought about it. "Mostly sometimes," he said. "Less than I used to be." Hattie seemed to find this acceptable. She leaned against his arm with the total unself-consciousness of a child who has not yet learned that you need permission to trust someone, and watched the frozen road ahead with the same serious expression she had worn since he'd crouched in the snow with those 2 large boots. He didn't move her. The ranch came into view through the pines as the afternoon light was thinning, gray and weak, barely distinguishable from the sky. The main house was not impressive, a long, low structure built from timber and fieldstone, functional rather than fine, with a covered porch and 2 chimneys that were both, mercifully, smoking. The barn was larger than the house, which said something about priorities. There were outbuildings, a fenced corral with 8 horses visible from the road, and a creek, frozen solid now, that ran along the western edge of the property. "It's not much," Rowan said, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "It has walls," Eliza said quietly. She wasn't being ironic. She meant exactly what she said. Marcus Webb came out of the barn before the wagon had fully stopped, moving with his characteristic careful deliberateness, a man who had long since made peace with the fact that he couldn't hurry. He looked at the wagon, at the passengers, at Rowan, and back at the passengers, and his face went through about 4 different expressions before settling on something carefully neutral. "Marcus," Rowan said, "this is Mrs. Mercer and her children. They'll be staying." Marcus looked at him for a moment with an expression that said, "We are going to have a conversation about this later, you and I." Then he pulled off his hat, old leather, beaten soft by years, and held it to his chest with both hands. "Ma'am," he said to Eliza, "you must be frozen half through. Let's get you inside." Pete Doyle appeared behind him, younger and less controlled, his expression cycling through shock and curiosity with no attempt at concealment. He stared at the children piling out of the wagon with the look of someone who has never considered that 6 of something might exist simultaneously. There's a lot of them," he said. "Pete," Rowan said. "Right, yeah, welcome." Pete grabbed the nearest grain sack with an energy that suggested he didn't know what else to do with himself. "Welcome to, the Hale Ranch. Welcome." Thomas, who had jumped down from the wagon and was surveying the property with those careful, calculating eyes, looked at Pete and then looked away, unimpressed. The second oldest boy, Eli, 13, who moved with a slight limp that nobody had explained and Rowan had not asked about, landed in the snow beside his brother and looked at the barn with the expression of someone who has spent enough time in one to know how it should feel. "That's good timber," Eli said, mostly to himself. "It is," Marcus said, overhearing. He glanced at the boy. "You know lumber?" "Some," Eli said, cautiously. "Your grandfather's mill?" The caution in Eli's face hardened into something more closed. "His mill," he said. "Not ours." Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Right," he said. He didn't push it. Inside, the house was warm in the way that only a wood stove can make a space warm. Not evenly or gently, but intensely and partially, hot near the stove and colder by the walls, with the smell of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular accumulated smell of a house lived in mostly by men. It was clean, because Rowan kept it that way by habit, if not by love, but it was bare. No curtains, no rugs, a shelf of books above the fireplace that hadn't been touched in months, a table large enough for four that was about to become inadequate. Eliza stood in the middle of the main room and looked around with that same careful, controlled expression she'd worn all day. "There are two bedrooms," Rowan said from behind her. "My room and a second one that's been used for storage. I'll clear it out tonight. You and the younger children can have it. The older boys can sleep in the barn. It's heated, cleaner than it sounds." "Where will you sleep?" she asked. "Porch room, off the back? It's fine." She turned and looked at him. It was the first time she'd really looked directly at him, he thought. Not the guarded sideways assessment she'd been doing all day, but a straight, direct look. "Why are you doing this?" she said. The children had scattered. Hattie was already investigating the bookshelf with her fingers. Two of the middle girls had found the kitchen and were looking at it with the intensity of hungry people trying to be polite about it. Thomas stood near the door like he hadn't decided yet whether to be inside or outside, and Eli had gone back out with Marcus without anyone asking him to. Rowan met Eliza's gaze. He thought about several answers. "I don't know," he said finally. "I saw the youngest one's feet." It was such a simple answer that she stared at him for a moment, like she was waiting for the rest of it. "That's all?" she said. "That's what started it." He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair, which he did when he was uncomfortable with a conversation and couldn't leave it. "The rest? I've got space, I've got food, I've got work that needs doing. It seemed like it made sense. You paid over $400 for people you don't know." "I paid over $400 to remove a debt that was being used as a weapon," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was not quite anger, more like the memory of anger, worn smooth. "That's different." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked away, at the room, at the children moving through it. Hattie had pulled a book off the shelf and was holding it upside down with the concentrated expression of someone who intends to read it as soon as they figure out the orientation. "I won't be a burden," Eliza said. Her voice was quiet, but there was iron in it, the kind that's been forged through use. "I can cook, I can manage a household, I can help with whatever work needs doing. My children are not lazy. We'll earn our place here." "You don't have to earn anything," Rowan said. She looked at him again, and her expression said plainly, and without cruelty, "You mean well, but you don't understand yet. Mr. Hale, I have spent too many years dependent on people who kept the account. I don't know you, and you don't know me. I need to carry my own weight. Please don't take that from me." He understood that. He didn't fully understand why he understood it, but he did. "All right," he said. "Well, that first night was awkward, in the way that first nights always are when strangers are forced into proximity by circumstances too large to have planned for." Rowan and Pete cleared out the second bedroom. Crates, a broken chair, 3 winter saddles, a trunk of Catherine's things that Rowan moved with a care he didn't examine, while Marcus, without being asked, started something on the stove that turned into a proper stew by the time the room was ready. The children ate with the intensity of the genuinely hungry. Not badly mannered, Rowan noticed. Eliza had clearly insisted on table manners under whatever circumstances they'd been living in, because they used their implements properly and said thank you when the bread was passed. But they ate without leaving anything on their plates, and the two youngest, Hattie and a boy named Sam who was 6, finished and looked at the pot with expressions of naked longing that they hadn't yet learned to conceal. Rowan picked up the ladle and served them both again without comment. Hattie looked at him across the table with those enormous, serious eyes. "Are you going to be mean later?" she asked. "Hattie," Eliza started. "It's a fair question," Rowan said. He thought about it because she was asking it sincerely and deserved a sincere answer. "I don't plan to be." "Grandfather said he wasn't going to be mean when Papa died," Hattie said, with the terrible clarity of a 4-year-old recounting a fact. "Then he was mean." The table was very quiet. Thomas was watching Rowan with those evaluation eyes, waiting. "I can't promise you I'll be perfect," Rowan said carefully. "I get frustrated sometimes. I have bad days. But I don't hit, and I don't threaten, and I don't take things away from people to make them do what I want. That's the best I can offer." Hattie considered this at some length. Then she apparently decided to table the question and reached for her stew. Thomas went back to eating too, and something in his shoulders had shifted. Not relaxed, not yet, but fractionally less rigid. After dinner, Rowan went out to the barn to check on the horses and found Eli there, standing with one of the mares, a gray called Patience, which was ironic given her temperament, talking to her in a low, steady voice while she allowed herself to be handled. Rowan stood in the barn door for a moment. The boy hadn't heard him come in. He was running his hand down the mare's neck with a confidence that surprised him. Not reckless, but certain, like he'd done it many times. "She bites," Rowan said. Eli didn't startle, just turned his head. "I noticed. She was testing me." He glanced back at the horse. She stopped. Rowan came in and checked the water in the trough, checked the feed, did the small habitual tasks of an evening barn check. Eli stayed with the mare, but didn't talk, which Rowan respected. After a minute, Rowan said, "You ride?" "Used to," Eli said. Brief. Then with slightly more, "Before my leg." "What happened to your leg?" A pause. The boy stroked the horse's jaw. "The mill," he said. "Gear caught my boot. I was 10. The words were said without drama, which somehow made them worse. "You work a timber mill at 10 years old," Rowan said, very flatly. "We all did." Eli looked at him with a directness that didn't seem young at all. "You've met my grandfather." Rowan had nothing useful to say to that. He hung his lantern on the hook by the door and picked up his gloves from the post where he'd left them. "If you want to learn horses," he said, "Marcus knows them better than anyone. You could ask him." Eli looked back at the mare. "He might not want to teach me." "Ask anyway," Rowan said. "He'll say yes. He always says yes to someone who's actually interested." He left the boy in his barn with the lantern and the gray mare and went back to the house, where the sounds of children settling for sleep were coming through the new walls for the first time in months, and the stove was burning low, and Eliza was sitting at the table with a cup of cold coffee she'd forgotten to drink, and the particular expression of a woman trying to make sense of a day that refused to resolve into something she recognized. She didn't look up when he came in. He put more wood on the fire. He poured himself coffee, also cold, and sat across from her without speaking. After a long while, she said, "He'll come after us." "Gideon." "He doesn't lose things," she said. "He never has. He's not—" She stopped, started again more carefully. "You don't know him." "I know men like him," Rowan said. "Not like him." She finally looked up. Her eyes, he noticed, were dark brown, and there was something very tired in them that had nothing to do with today. "He'll use the law. He has men on the county court, he has money and patience, and he has never in his life accepted a result he didn't choose." She paused. "He'll find a way to take them back. He'll find a way to say I'm unfit, or that there's something wrong with the arrangement. He'll find something." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "Let him try," he said. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite hope, more like the skeptical first cousin of hope, the version that has been disappointed enough times to keep its distance. "You can't fight that kind of money," she said. "Maybe not," Rowan said, "but I've got lawyers in Billings I've used for land disputes, and they're good. And I've got the paperwork Gideon himself had drawn up, with his own man's seal on it, signing away the debt in exchange for the family's release. That's his signature. That's his act." She said nothing. "I'm not going to tell you it's going to be simple," he said. "I don't know what he'll try, but he can't just take you back. He gave you up legally. He knows that." "He'll find another way," she said. "Maybe," Rowan said again. "We'll deal with it when it comes." She looked at him for a long time. That direct measuring look again, the one that seemed to be looking for the catch, the fine print, the place where the generosity curdled into something else. She didn't find it. Not tonight. She looked back down at her cold coffee. "My youngest," she said quietly. "Hattie. She's 4. She walked 2 miles in the snow this morning without shoes because Gideon said the shoes were his property." Her voice was absolutely level, absolutely controlled. "He said the shoes were his property." Rowan said nothing. There was nothing to say. "She didn't cry," Eliza said. "She's 4 years old, and she didn't cry." She pressed her fingers flat against the table. "I need you to understand what kind of man you've made an enemy of." "I think I'm beginning to," Rowan said. She picked up her coffee cup, seemed to remember it was cold, set it down. "Good night, Mr. Hale," she said, and went to her children. Rowan sat alone at the table for a while after she'd gone, listening to the sounds of the house settle around him. The creak of wood contracting in the cold, the low sound of the fire, the distant, barely audible breathing of sleeping children through the wall. He thought about the morning, about standing in that square and hearing the crowd's silence and doing the math on whether it was his problem, about a little girl's bare feet in the snow. He thought about Catherine, as he always did on nights when things had shifted in ways he couldn't predict, as though she was the fixed point he checked against when the world tilted. He thought about what she would have made of today. He thought she would have said something both practical and cutting that cut through all his uncertainty and told him exactly where he stood. She had been good at that. "You didn't go looking for this," she might have said. "But here it is. Don't make it smaller than it is." He wasn't sure what it was yet. He wasn't sure what he'd started today, or what it was going to cost him, or whether any of it made a kind of sense that would be visible from the other side of it. But the house was full of sounds it hadn't had in a year and a half. The stove was burning. 7 people had eaten dinner. He got up and went to bed. Outside, the Montana cold pressed against every wall and window, indifferent as always, doing what it had always done. But inside the long, low ranch house in the foothills, 7 strangers slept under a roof that was, for tonight at least, theirs. Not because of blood, not because of law, not yet because of anything as complex as belonging, but because a man had looked at bleeding feet in the snow and decided that was enough. The first week was not a disaster, which was the best anyone could have said for it. Rowan had expected friction. What he hadn't expected was the particular texture of it. Not one large collision, but 100 small ones. The daily negotiation of 7 new people, learning the geography of a space that had been built around absence. The house was not large enough for comfort, and not small enough for forced familiarity, which meant everyone spent the first several days navigating around each other with the careful, slightly exhausting politeness of people who don't yet know which irritations are worth raising and which are better swallowed. Eliza was in the kitchen before anyone else each morning. Rowan had told her she didn't have to do that, and she had listened to him say it with the expression of someone waiting patiently for a well-meaning person to finish a sentence that didn't apply to them. By the 3rd morning, he stopped saying it. She cooked efficiently and without waste, the way someone cooks who has had long practice with not having enough. The kind of cooking that uses every part of everything and makes no apologies for being plain. The first morning, she produced biscuits from the pantry stores and a pot of porridge that fed 9 people, Marcus and Pete included. And when Pete made the mistake of saying he didn't usually eat porridge, she looked at him with an expression so neutral it bordered on surgical, and Pete ate 2 full bowls without another word. Thomas remained difficult. That was the honest assessment, and Rowan was trying to be honest with himself about it, rather than charitable, in ways that avoided the truth. The boy was 14, going on some age that didn't have a name. He had the body of someone who had been doing hard physical work since he was too young for it, wide in the shoulders, calloused in the hands, but the face was still young enough that the hardness in it looked borrowed rather than grown. He did the work he was asked to do. He showed up, completed tasks, didn't complain aloud. But he watched Rowan the way a dog that's been kicked watches new hands reaching toward it, not hostile enough to snap, but ready to, and very conscious of the distance between them at all times. On the 4th morning, Rowan came out to the corral to find Thomas attempting to repair a section of fence rail that had cracked in the freeze. The boy had the right idea but was executing it wrong, using a short nail where a long one was needed, which would hold for a day and fail the first time a horse leaned against it. Rowan stood and watched for a moment. Then he went to the tool shed and came back with the right nails. He set them on the fence post within Thomas's reach and went back to what he'd been doing. He didn't say anything, didn't explain, just left them there. Thomas stopped, looked at the nails, looked at Rowan's retreating back. Then, with a deliberateness that suggested he was making a choice rather than conceding, he picked up the longer nail and started over. It wasn't trust. It wasn't even close to trust. But it was something. Eli was easier, which surprised Rowan because the boy had more tangible reasons to be closed off. The injury to his leg had left him with a permanent slight drag on the left side. Not severe enough to stop him, but present enough that you couldn't miss it, and there was something in the way he moved through the world that accounted for it constantly. An awareness of terrain, of footing, of where the ground might shift. He had accepted Marcus's offer to learn the horses with a wariness that lasted about 40 minutes. And then Marcus had put him on a gentle quarter horse named Bishop, and the wariness had dissolved into something that looked for the first time like a 14-year-old boy. "He's a natural," Marcus told Rowan that evening, with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose opinion of people is mostly confirmed by how they handle animals. Soft hands. Doesn't try to control, just communicates. Bishop was settled with him inside 10 minutes. His grandfather worked him in a timber mill since he was 10, Rowan said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that was different from Rowan's. Where Rowan's silences tended toward the sealed, Marcus's were more like rooms that were still being furnished. Boy like that, he said finally, needed something that would respond well to being treated gently. He pulled his hat back on. Horses are good for that. The girls, Clara at 11, Rose at 9, and the two youngest, Hattie at 4 and little Annie at 7, adapted with the speed that children adapt when the alternative is not adapting, which is to say quickly and with a completeness that occasionally startled the adults. By the end of the first week, Hattie had constructed an elaborate ongoing relationship with Pete Doyle, based primarily on the fact that Pete, at 22, was young enough to be manipulated and old enough to know it and choose not to care. She followed him to the barn in the mornings with the fixed determination of a small satellite and narrated his work to him in a continuous stream of commentary that he bore with remarkable good nature. "You're doing that wrong," she informed him on the 5th day, watching him muck a stall. "I've been doing this for 3 years," Pete said. "I've been watching for 5 days," Hattie said, which was apparently her response to that. Pete leaned on his pitchfork and looked at her. "You know what? Fine, show me." She was too small to actually demonstrate anything useful, but she directed him through the remaining stalls with authoritative precision, and Pete followed her instructions with exaggerated seriousness, and neither of them mentioned that the stalls had never been cleaner. Eliza watched this from the kitchen window while she was kneading bread dough, and something in her face went through a change too quick and too private to name. She looked back down at her work. She and Rowan were careful with each other. That was the word for it. Careful. Not unfriendly, not cold, but precise in a way that had the quality of two people who have each decided, independently, that there are too many other things to manage right now to also manage whatever this is. They talked about the ranch. They talked about the children. They talked about what was needed from town and who would go and what the weather was likely to do. They moved around each other in the kitchen and in the main room with a consideration that occasionally brushed against something warmer, and then one or both of them would find something else to attend to. On the 8th night, after the children were in bed, and Marcus and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, Eliza came into the main room to find Rowan sitting at the table with a letter he'd been reading for a long time. She almost turned around. Then she said, "Bad news?" He looked up. He hadn't heard her come in. He folded the letter in a way that wasn't quite quick enough to be secretive, just the reflexive privacy of someone who doesn't share things easily. "From Gideon's attorney," he said. She came further into the room, and something in her posture changed. The slight elevation at the shoulders, the stillness that wasn't peace. "What does it say?" "He's contesting the arrangement." Rowan set the letter on the table. Claims the transfer was conducted under duress. His word against the facts of what actually happened. He paused. He's also claiming that the children's welfare is in question, that an unmarried man with no family has no appropriate standing to house a widow and her children. Eliza sat down at the table. She put her hands flat on the wood. "That's the one he'll push," she said. "The morality argument. He knows this territory. He knows the judges." "I know some of them too," Rowan said. "Not the way he does." Her voice was even, not accusing him of naivety, just stating a fact. He's had 20 years and a lot of money to accumulate the kind of knowing that matters in a courtroom. Rowan leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, which was what he did when he was working through something he hadn't resolved yet. "My lawyer in Billings thinks we have a strong position on the debt transfer. The paperwork is solid. Gideon signed it himself. He'll say he was pressured." "By one man and 60 silent witnesses?" Rowan said, with a dryness that was close to humor but not quite. "By an opportunist who exploited a grieving grandfather's distress." Her voice had taken on a precision that was deliberately unpleasant, and he realized she was mimicking, predicting the language. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since before that first night's conversation, probably. She had known this was coming with the certainty of someone who knows how a particular person operates. "He'll paint you as a schemer and me as either a fool or complicit. He'll find something wrong with how we're living, something he can point to and make sound scandalous. A single man, a widowed woman, 6 children." She paused. "He doesn't need to win. He just needs to create enough confusion that a judge gets cautious." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then, what would give us the clearest legal standing? She looked at him. He looked at the table. There was a long silence in which both of them understood what had just been said beneath the thing that had been said, and neither of them moved. No, Eliza said. I'm not suggesting. You're absolutely suggesting, she said. Her voice was not angry. It was the voice of someone who is managing anger with effort. You just put it as a question, so neither of us has to say it directly. He met her eyes. It would give you legal status in a way that nothing else does right now. It would make Gideon's morality argument disappear. And it would put me in exactly the situation I spent 5 years trying to survive, she said, and her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, and she pressed her mouth closed for a moment. Then, I was 17 when I married Daniel Mercer. I didn't know what I was walking into. I learned. She looked at him steadily. I will not do it again just to fix a legal problem. I'm not Daniel Mercer, he said quietly. No, she said. You're not. You're a man I've known for 8 days. That was accurate. He had nothing to say to it. She pushed back from the table and stood. I appreciate what you've done for us. I mean that genuinely, but I'm not a solution to your legal problem, and I'm not going to let desperation make me stupid again. She picked up her shawl from the back of the chair. Talk to your lawyer. Find another way. She went to her room. Rowan sat at the table with Gideon's letter and the fire burning low and the full weight of what he'd just suggested, and what it said about how clearly, or not, he was thinking. He sat there for a while. He was not sure what he'd meant by it exactly. He wasn't sure if he'd meant it purely legally, the way he'd framed it, or if there was something else working underneath that framing that he hadn't yet gotten close enough to examine. He put the letter in the stove and went to bed. Outside, the wind had picked up. February was not going to be easier than January had been. 3 days later, Gideon came. He didn't come alone. He came with the thin lawyer man, whose name turned out to be Aldous Crane, and with a county sheriff's deputy named Foster, who was young and clearly uncomfortable about the whole errand and kept his eyes on the middle distance with the focused neutrality of a man trying to be somewhere else. Rowan saw the horses coming up the road from the porch and went inside and said, Eliza, and the way he said it was enough. She came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a cloth, and looked through the window and went very still for about 2 seconds. Then she turned and said to Clara, who was nearest, Take the younger ones to the back bedroom. Not as a punishment, just do it quietly. Clara was old enough to understand the tone. She had the 4 youngest out of the room in under a minute. Thomas and Eli stayed, having also heard the tone and made the opposite decision. Rowan went to the door and opened it before Gideon could knock, which was a small, deliberate thing but not meaningless. Gideon stood on the porch with his lawyer and his uncomfortable deputy, looking past Rowan into the house with the particular quality of looking that is actually surveying. He was wearing the same wool coat he'd worn in the square, or one identical to it, and the same expression of a man who has already decided how this conversation ends. Hail, he said. Mercer. Rowan stood in the doorframe. He didn't move back. You can say what you came to say from there. Gideon's jaw moved slightly. I have legal right to visit my family under the terms. You surrendered custody and visitation rights in exchange for settlement of the debt, Rowan said. You have Aldous Crane standing right next to you. Ask him what the document says. Crane looked at the middle distance, which was apparently his preferred place to look. Those documents were signed under irregular circumstances, Gideon said. You brought the documents. Your man wrote them. Your signature is on them. I'm not here to argue, Gideon said, which was the most demonstrably false thing he had said so far. I'm here as a concerned grandfather who has not seen his grandchildren in over a week. Surely no reasonable man would— I would like you to leave, Eliza said. She had come up beside Rowan. She was not touching him. They were simply standing in the same doorway, 2 people who happened to be occupying the same position relative to something they both needed to address. But the effect of it, 2 people standing together rather than one, was not nothing. Gideon looked at her. His expression didn't change in ways that were visible, but something shifted in the quality of his stillness, the way a man stills when something has not gone the way he scripted it. Eliza, he said. His voice was different toward her. Not softer exactly, but more intimate, which was somehow worse. The voice of someone who has established a long-standing authority and expects it to still function. These children are my blood. You cannot simply— They are my children, she said. Not your property, not your debt, not your bargaining pieces. Mine. She held his gaze in a way that clearly cost her something. Her hands, which Rowan could see at her sides, were not entirely steady. And you will not come onto this property and speak to them or about them without my permission, which I am telling you now, clearly you do not have. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Rowan. The look he gave Rowan was a different thing entirely. Not contempt exactly, though contempt was in there. More like the look of a man filing something away, cataloging an obstacle he intends to deal with through means that have nothing to do with the current conversation. Deputy Foster, Gideon said, without breaking eye contact with Rowan. I'd like you to note that I have been denied access to my grandchildren on the property of a man with no legal familial standing, in possible violation of— I'd like to note, Rowan said to Deputy Foster and not to Gideon, that I have a copy of the signed settlement document at the Black Ridge Bank, with Aldous Crane's seal on it. The county court is welcome to review it at any time. Foster looked like he would rather be in a different profession. Yes, sir. I'll note both. Gideon was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not the end of something but a repositioning. Then he straightened, which was the gesture of a man who has decided that this particular field is not where his victory lies. We'll see each other again, Hale, he said. It was not a threat, technically, but it wasn't nothing either. I imagine so, Rowan said. Gideon turned and went back to his horse. Crane followed, still looking at the middle distance, the most determined avoider of eye contact Rowan had ever encountered. Foster lingered for half a second, caught Rowan's eye, gave a small uncomfortable nod that seemed to mean something like I'm sorry about this, and then followed the others. Rowan and Eliza stood in the doorway until the horses were back on the road. Then Rowan became aware that Thomas was standing directly behind him, close enough that he could feel the boy there, and that Thomas had been there the entire time. He turned. Thomas was watching the retreating figures with an expression that had nothing of the boy in it. He's going to come back, Thomas said, not asking. Yes, Rowan said. Thomas looked at him. The evaluation was still there, in his eyes, but something in it had changed slightly. Some element of the assessment that had shifted from can he be trusted to what can he do? It was a small difference and not uncomplicated, but it was a shift. What are you going to do? Thomas asked. Rowan looked at him for a moment. He thought about giving a reassuring answer. He decided against it. Everything I can, he said. And then some things I probably haven't thought of yet. Thomas held his gaze for another beat. Then he went back into the house without another word, passing his mother in the hallway. And Eliza watched him go with the expression of a woman reading something in her son's posture she hadn't seen in a long time. She looked at Rowan. That was the first time in 2 years he's asked anyone a question like that, she said quietly. Rowan wasn't sure what to do with that. He went to put more wood on the fire. The visit from Gideon sharpened everything. That was the word for it. Not worsened exactly, but clarified, the way a cold front clarifies the air, makes things more visible and more bracing simultaneously. The children, who had relaxed incrementally through the first week, had been reminded of what they were actually dealing with. The older ones, Thomas and Eli, moved through the next several days with a new quality of attention, alert in ways they'd learned to be alert. The younger ones asked questions that the older ones had already stopped asking. Is grandfather coming back? Can he take us? What happens if he takes us? Eliza answered these questions with a steadiness that impressed Rowan in the way that very hard things done very quietly impress you, not with fanfare, but with the slow accumulation of recognition. She didn't lie. She didn't promise what she couldn't guarantee. She said with precision, "We are working on making sure that doesn't happen. Mr. Hale is helping us. You are safe right now, tonight, in this house." And she said right now and tonight on purpose, because she was a woman who had learned that false certainties collapse and real ones hold, and she would only offer what she could actually deliver. On a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the Mercers' arrival, Rowan rode to Billings. I was gone for 2 days. He left Marcus in charge, which Marcus was adequate for, and told Eliza only that he had business with his attorney and would return by Saturday. She didn't ask for more than that. She was too busy for questions she couldn't act on. She had taken over the household management with a completeness that left Rowan unsure whether to be relieved or guilty, and had also begun helping Pete with some of the ranch's rougher supply accounting, which had been handled badly for months, and which she had apparently identified as badly handled within approximately 48 hours of arrival. When Rowan returned Saturday afternoon, he came into the kitchen where Eliza was working, removed his coat, and set a folder of papers on the table. "My attorney thinks we can defeat the custody challenge on the merits," he said, But it's going to take time, and it's going to require the children to be available to speak to the court. He also thinks—" He paused. He was looking at the papers and not at her. "He said the same thing I said about legal standing, that without it, Gideon has room to work." Eliza set down the ladle she was holding. She didn't turn around immediately. "He also," Rowan continued carefully, "suggested a third possibility, that we present the case as what it actually is, a man who took in a family in distress and is providing for them appropriately, and argue that the court has no grounds to question the moral arrangement of a private household that is clearly functioning and clearly not causing harm." He paused. "He thinks it's a defensible position. He thinks it's harder than the other option, but not impossible." Eliza turned around. She looked at him. "That's the option you want to pursue," she said. "Not a question. That's the option that doesn't require either of us to do something we're not ready to do," he said. He met her eyes. "I shouldn't have raised it the way I did last week. I was thinking about the legal problem and not about what I was actually suggesting. I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment. She had the expression of someone recalibrating, adjusting a previous assessment based on new information. "Apology accepted," she said. Brief, without embellishment. She picked up the ladle again. "Tell me about the attorney." He sat down at the table and told her about the attorney, whose name was Franklin Webb, no relation to Marcus, and who had spent 15 years fighting land claims in Montana Territory and had a reputation for tenacity that bordered on the belligerent. Eliza listened, asked questions that were pointed and specific, and made 2 suggestions that Rowan wrote down because they were better than what he'd been thinking. It was the first time they had sat at that table and talked through something as though they were simply 2 people working on the same problem, without the weight of everything else underneath it, or at least with that weight set temporarily aside. When they were done, Hattie appeared from under the table, she had apparently been there the entire time, which explained the rustling Rowan had attributed to a draft, and announced that she was hungry. "You just had lunch," Eliza said. "That was a long time ago," Hattie said. "It was 40 minutes ago." Hattie appeared to find this a technicality rather than an argument. She looked at Rowan. "Are you hungry?" He thought about it. "Actually, yes." "See?" Hattie said to her mother, as though this resolved everything. Eliza closed her eyes for approximately 2 seconds, and when she opened them, something in her face had shifted. Not quite a smile, the muscles not fully committed, but the direction of a smile, the intention of one. "Get the bread from the shelf," she said to Hattie. Hattie scrambled out from under the table. Rowan watched her go and then looked back at Eliza, who was already turning back to the stove. But he had seen that almost smile, and it stayed with him in the particular way that small things stay with you when you've been a long time without them. Outside, the February cold was still brutal, still indifferent. The Montana sky sat low and gray over the foothills, and the creek was still frozen solid, and Gideon Mercer was somewhere in Black Ridge, patient and resourceful, working through his options with the quiet, systematic energy of a man accustomed to winning. But inside the kitchen, there was bread and heat, and a 4-year-old who had positioned herself on the counter despite 2 firm requests to get down. And Eli was in the barn with the horses, and Thomas had just come in the back door with an armful of firewood without being asked. And somewhere down the hall, Clara was teaching Annie a song she'd learned from who knew where, and the sound of it moved through the house like something the house hadn't had in a long time. Not peace, exactly. Nothing here was peace, not yet, maybe not for a long while. But something close enough to it that, from a certain angle, in a certain light, it was hard to tell the difference. Rowan drank his coffee and let himself notice it, just for that moment, before the next thing arrived that needed dealing with. There was always a next thing. He had learned that much. The letter from Franklin Webb arrived on a Tuesday, and it was not good news. Rowan read it twice at the kitchen table, folded it, and sat with it for a long moment before Eliza came in from outside with mud on her boots, and the particular look on her face of someone who has just finished a disagreement with a fence post and lost. She stopped when she saw his expression. "What?" she said. He handed her the letter. She read it standing, still in her coat, not bothering to sit because she had apparently already understood from the quality of his silence that sitting was not going to make it better. The letter was 3 pages of Franklin Webb's careful legal hand, and it laid out, with the methodical clarity of a man who charged by the hour and believed in being thorough, what Gideon Mercer had done. He had filed a petition in the county court, not for custody, not directly, not yet. but for a formal inquiry into the welfare of the children currently residing at the Hale Ranch, on grounds that the household arrangement was irregular and potentially harmful to their moral development. He had attached to the petition 3 signed affidavits from Black Ridge residents, attesting to the irregular nature of the arrangement. He had, through a contact on the county board, managed to have the inquiry assigned to Judge Harlan Price, who was 63 years old, had been on the bench for 20 years, and was known, Franklin Webb wrote, with the restraint of a man choosing his words carefully, for his conservative interpretation of domestic arrangements. The inquiry was scheduled for the 14th of March, 6 weeks away. Eliza lowered the letter when she was done. She looked at the wall for a moment. 3 affidavits, she said. He didn't need many, Rowan said. He needed enough to get the petition accepted. He got it accepted. Who signed them? Webb doesn't know yet. He's trying to find out. Rowan got up and poured himself coffee that he didn't particularly want. He says we need to counter with testimony of our own. People who can speak to the actual conditions here, the actual treatment of the children. Marcus, Eliza said immediately. Pete. They're employees. Gideon's attorney will argue they're motivated to speak in my favor. She turned and looked at him, and her expression was the one she wore when she was working through something that had corners she hadn't found yet. The school teacher, she said. Miss Aldrin. Clara and Thomas have been attending school for 3 weeks. She can speak to their condition when they arrived and their condition now. Rowan paused. That's good. It's a start. She pulled off her coat and hung it by the door, moving with a brisk efficiency that he recognized as her response to things she couldn't control. Not denial, but directed energy. Find the thing you can act on. Act on it. Reverend, she stopped herself. The doctor. Dr. Haverford came out when Annie had that cough 2 weeks ago. He saw the children. He saw the house. He'd need to be willing to testify. He's a decent man. Ask him. She sat down across the table from him. What else does Webb say? Rowan looked at the last page of the letter. He says that without a formal legal relationship between you and me, Judge Price has wide discretion to decide what constitutes an appropriate household arrangement. He says, he paused. He says Gideon's petition specifically names the lack of marital arrangement as the primary concern, that it's framed as a question of propriety. He expects Gideon's attorney to push that point hard in front of Price. Eliza was quiet. Webb is recommending, Rowan said, and he kept his voice very level and his eyes on the letter rather than her face, that we address the question of standing before the hearing, not during it. He says if we walk into that courtroom with the current arrangement unchanged, we're handing Price a reason to rule against us, regardless of everything else. The kitchen was very quiet. From somewhere outside came the sound of Pete talking to one of the horses, his voice carrying the faint rhythm of someone singing badly and not caring. He means the same thing you meant 3 weeks ago, Eliza said. Yes. She put her hands on the table. They were not steady, but she didn't take them off the table. And your answer now is the same as it was then? My answer now, Rowan said carefully, is that it's your decision and I have no interest in pressuring you into anything. Webb says it's the strongest possible legal position. I'm telling you that because you deserve to know it. What you do with it is yours. She stood up and went to the window. Outside, the February light was flat and pale, the kind of light that makes everything look provisional, like the world is waiting to decide whether to continue. She stood there for a long time without speaking, and Rowan let her stand there. What kind of marriage? She said finally. Her voice was very controlled. Practically. What would it actually mean? Exactly what you set as the conditions, he said. You keep your authority over your children. Your decisions about the household are your own. Nothing changes about what this is. Legally, you'd have standing as my wife. In practice, it would be what it already is. A legal arrangement, she said. Yes. She turned from the window. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated and honest and did not pretend to be anything simpler than it was. I need you to understand something, she said. When I was married to Daniel, I had no ground to stand on. Not legally, not practically. He wasn't cruel the way his father is cruel, but he didn't see me as someone whose opinion mattered, who had a separate existence that deserved to be considered. She stopped, started again. I spent 5 years learning how to survive inside that, and when he died, I told myself I would never again be in a position where my standing in my own life depended on someone else's name. I know, Rowan said. You don't actually, she said, but not unkindly. You know the facts of it. That's not the same thing. He accepted that. No, it's not. She looked at him for a long moment, and whatever she was looking for in his face, she must have found at least enough of it, because she looked away and said, "What would the conditions be, specifically, not in principle, written down?" "Whatever you need them to be." "I need them to be specific," she said. "I need them on paper. I need to be able to point to them." "Then we'll put them on paper," he said. "Webb can draw up an agreement alongside the marriage certificate. Your rights to the children are unilateral. Your decisions about the household stand. If the legal situation resolves and you want to leave, you leave. I won't contest it." She looked at him. "You'd agree to that?" "It's your life," he said simply. "I'm not trying to buy it." She was quiet for a very long moment. The kind of quiet that is not empty, but full of things being weighed against each other. The past against the present, the known against the unknowable, fear against necessity, and whatever small new thing was beginning to exist in the space between those two people in that kitchen that neither of them had named yet, and both of them were carefully not looking at directly. "I'll think about it," she said. She didn't say it the way people say it when they mean no. She said it the way someone says it when they are genuinely, seriously going to think about it, and the outcome is not yet determined. Rowan nodded. "Take the time you need." She took 4 days. On the 4th night, she came to him in the main room where he was doing the ranch accounts, a task he hated and was not good at, which Eliza had already identified and was already quietly improving without having been asked. And she sat across from him and said, "The conditions need to include that you don't make decisions about the children without consulting me first. Not just major decisions, any decision that affects their daily life." He set down his pencil. "Done. And if the situation with Gideon resolves cleanly, if he loses the petition and there's no further legal threat, we revisit the arrangement. Together. Not you deciding, not me deciding. Together." "Agreed." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not doing this because I want to," she said, and there was no cruelty in it, just a precision she apparently felt was necessary. "I'm doing it because the alternative is worse." "I know," he said. "As long as we both understand that." "We do," he said. She nodded once, stood up, and went to bed. It was not, by any measure, a romantic moment. It was two people making a decision under difficult circumstances, with as much honesty as they could manage between them, which was more honesty than either of them had expected to be capable of. It was not nothing. They were married the following Friday, in the Black Ridge Courthouse, with Franklin Webb present by telegraph confirmation and Marcus and Pete as witnesses. The ceremony lasted 7 minutes and was conducted by a justice of the peace named Gerald Holt, who had married approximately 300 couples in his tenure and had learned to read the room well enough to keep his commentary to an absolute minimum. He kept his commentary to an absolute minimum. The children knew. Rowan and Eliza had told them together, the evening before, gathered in the main room with the fire going and the particular weight of 6 pairs of eyes that ranged from old enough to understand everything to young enough to understand only the tone. Eliza had explained it plainly, that the legal arrangement would help protect them, that it changed the formalities of things without changing the actual things, that Mr. Hale was and would remain what he had been since the first day. Hattie had listened to all of this with her usual focused attention and then said, "So he's our father now?" "He's Mr. Hale," Eliza said carefully. Hattie appeared to consider the distinction insufficient. "But he lives here." "Yes." "And he got me boots." "Yes." "Papa didn't get me boots," Hattie said, with the evaluative clarity of a 4-year-old for whom this was apparently the operative criterion, and then apparently considered the matter settled and asked if there was going to be cake. Thomas said nothing that evening. He sat through the explanation and the subsequent conversation with his arms folded and his face closed, and afterward went to his room, the bunkhouse room he and Eli shared, which had become their room with remarkable speed, and didn't come out again that night. The next morning, before the wedding, Rowan went to the bunkhouse. He knocked. Thomas opened the door, already dressed, already wearing the expression of someone who has decided to be unreachable. Rowan looked at him. He had not prepared anything particular to say, which was probably the right instinct. "You can tell me if you're angry," he said. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'm not angry." "You're something." A pause. Something moved in the boy's face. A crack in the surface, quickly controlled. "She had to ask his permission," he said. His voice was flat. When Papa was alive, she had to ask permission for everything. What we where we went. She'd ask, and sometimes he'd say yes, and sometimes he wouldn't, and he stopped. She just lived like that. Rowan waited. She said this is different, Thomas said, that this is her choosing. It is, Rowan said. How am I supposed to know that? Rowan thought about several answers. He chose the honest one. You're not yet, he said. You're going to have to watch for a while and see. He paused. But I'll tell you this. I will not make a decision about this family without talking to your mother first. That's not a feeling I'm describing. That's a condition of the arrangement. It's written down. Thomas looked at him. The evaluation was still there. It might always be there, Rowan was beginning to think, or at least it would be for a long time. But there was a slightly different quality to it now. Not trust, but something that could become trust if sufficient evidence accumulated. She was happy once, Thomas said. Quieter now. Before, when I was small. He looked past Rowan at the barn wall. I'd like her to be happy again. So would I, Rowan said. They stood there for a moment in the cold doorway of the bunkhouse. Then Thomas stepped back and got his coat from the hook inside and came out, and they walked to the house together. The wedding was not a celebration. There was no particular ceremony after the courthouse, no party, nothing that marked it as a thing to commemorate. Eliza wore her better dress, which was clean and whole, but not new. Rowan wore his one good coat. They signed the papers, stood while Gerald Holt said the necessary words, and Marcus shook Rowan's hand with quiet force, while Pete stood behind him trying to decide what expression was appropriate, and settling on a kind of earnest solemnity that made him look like a man attending both a wedding and a funeral simultaneously. On the drive back to the ranch, Hattie asked again about cake. Eliza told her there was no cake. Hattie said this was a poor way to do things. Nobody disagreed. That night, after the children were in bed, Rowan and Eliza sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and did not speak for a long time. And the silence was not the comfortable kind, but it was not the bad kind either. It was the silence of two people who are not yet sure what they are to each other, but have agreed, at least, to find out. 3 days after the wedding, Gideon's attorney filed an amended petition. It was nastier than the original. Crane had done his work, somewhere in Black Ridge, through sources that Franklin Webb spent a week trying to identify. He had found not just the 3 original affidavit signers, but 5 more. He had constructed a portrait of Rowan Hale that was technically accurate in its facts and deeply dishonest in its framing. A solitary man of unstable temperament, haunted by personal tragedy, who had acted impulsively in a public setting and was now attempting to legitimize that impulse through a hasty marriage to a vulnerable woman. The petition questioned whether the marriage was genuine or purely legal in nature, suggested that the children were being used as labor on the ranch, and raised the question of the older boy's educational attendance, which was, Rowan noted with cold fury, listed as irregular, though Thomas and Eli had missed exactly 2 days, once for weather and once when Annie was sick and all hands were needed. It also contained something that Rowan had not anticipated, which was the testimony of a woman named Margaret Purvis, who had been Eliza's neighbor in the house she'd shared with Daniel Mercer, and who stated in her affidavit that Eliza Mercer had, on multiple occasions, spoken of Gideon Mercer as a difficult but essentially caring figure in the family's life, and that she had never personally witnessed any cruelty or deprivation on his part. Eliza read this paragraph 3 times. Then she set the letter on the table with precise, controlled movements, and said, Margaret Purvis was in Gideon's employ as a laundress for 6 years. Rowan said nothing, because there was nothing immediately useful to say. She watched him send the children to the mill, Eliza said. She watched Hattie go barefoot in November because Gideon said shoes were wasteful for children that age. Her voice was very even, which was a different thing from calm. She brought Hattie a pair of her granddaughter's old shoes and then took them back 3 days later because he told her to. The fire popped. Outside, the wind was doing what Montana wind did in February, which was everything. We'll need to address it, Rowan said. I know. She looked at him, and her expression had the quality of someone who has just had a particular illusion, confirmed as an illusion, not surprised, but still affected. She was afraid of him, she said. She still is. A pause. I understand that. I needed to say it. That I understand it. I know, he said. She looked at the letter again. There are 4 weeks until the hearing. What do we do? And this was the thing that had changed, Rowan realized. The way she had said we. Not as though she'd ceded anything, not as a dependency. As a fact of the situation, offered without drama. Two people working on the same problem. Webb is coming from Billings next week, he said. He wants to sit with you, and with Thomas, and probably with Clara as well, to prepare them for the possibility of testimony. He says the children speaking will be the most powerful element of the case, that no amount of legal argument matches the actual words of the children about how they've been treated. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that was not quite fear, more like the reluctance of a mother being asked to put her children somewhere exposed. They're young. I know, Webb knows. He'll be careful with them. Rowan paused. It's their choice, too. The same way everything here is their choice. She looked at him. You keep saying that, their choice. My choice. Because it's true. Most people don't operate that way. Most people, Rowan said, aren't trying to build the same thing we are. She looked at him carefully. What are we building? He thought about it, genuinely, rather than reaching for the easy answer. Something that doesn't have a crack where someone like Gideon can put a lever, he said, finally. She considered that for a moment. Then, for the second time since he'd known her, the second time in 6 weeks, she almost smiled, the muscles not fully committed, the intention clear. That's a practical answer, she said. I'm a practical man, he said. I noticed. They sat in the kitchen for another hour after that, not talking much, but present in the same room with a quality of ease that had not been there before. Not comfort, exactly. Not yet, but the first rough shape of it. The way a path looks before it's been walked enough times to become familiar. Franklin Webb arrived on a Wednesday in a wool coat so heavy it looked structural, a man of 50 with the build of someone who had once been stocky and remained so, and the quick, impatient energy of a person for whom other people's irresolution is a professional hazard. He shook Rowan's hand, nodded at Eliza with the brisk respect of a man who had dealt with enough capable women in distress to identify them on sight, and within 20 minutes was at the kitchen table with his papers spread out and his coffee going cold, because he kept forgetting to drink it. I was thorough and he was honest, which Rowan had valued when they dealt over land disputes and valued more now. He laid out what they had, the signed settlement documents, Dr. Haverford's written statement, Miss Aldrin's willingness to speak, Marcus's and Pete's testimony, the documented discrepancy between Gideon's description of the children's school attendance and the school's own records. He also laid out what they were up against, without softening it. Judge Price had ruled against 2 prior cases with similar irregular household arguments. Gideon's attorney was good, practiced in front of Price specifically, and clearly had a strategy built around the marriage's speed and convenience. The amended petition's personal attack on Rowan's character was not legally significant, but was designed for Price's sensibilities. Paint a picture of impulsiveness and instability. Let the judge's own assumptions do the rest of the work. The children's testimony will be essential, Webb said, and looked at Eliza as he said it. She met his gaze. I know. Specifically Thomas, Webb said. He's 15, which is old enough for the court to take seriously. He was present at the public square. He has direct experience of both households. If he can describe, in his own words, the conditions in Gideon's house and the conditions here, Webb spread his hands. It's the kind of thing a judge can't easily dismiss. Eliza said nothing for a moment. Then, let me talk to him first. Of course. She talked to Thomas that evening, out on the porch where the cold was still biting, but the sky had cleared for once, and the stars were the particular brilliant scatter that happened in Montana when the temperature dropped below 20 and the air went still. Rowan could see them through the kitchen window. Eliza in her shawl, Thomas slightly taller than her now in a way that seemed recent. The two of them talking with the particular body language of a mother and a nearly grown son having a conversation that is hard but necessary. He could not hear what they said. He did not try. After 20 minutes, they came back inside. Thomas went to find Webb, who was reviewing papers in the main room, and sat down across from him with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is done deliberating. Tell me what you need, Thomas said to Webb. Webb looked at him for a moment with the assessing regard of a man who has interviewed a great many witnesses. Then he nodded and opened his notes. Rowan went to the kitchen, where Eliza was standing at the stove with her back to the room and her shoulders slightly less rigid than they had been all evening. You all right? He said. I will be, she said. She turned around, and her eyes were dry, which he thought had cost her something. He wants to do it. He said. She paused. He said he's been wanting to say what happened, the real version of it, since the square. He said when Gideon was talking, in front of all those people, he said it felt like being erased, like the story Gideon was telling had replaced the actual truth, and no one was going to say anything. Rowan understood that. He understood it in the way you understand something that has its own specific texture, that you've touched before, even if not in the same place. He won't be erased in that courtroom, Rowan said. Eliza looked at him. Something in her eyes had a quality he hadn't seen there before. Not softness, still not that, but something adjacent to it. Something that was considering softness as a possibility rather than a vulnerability. You should know, she said, that this is not. She stopped. Started differently. I don't regret it, she said. The arrangement. What we agreed to. Good, he said. I'm not saying more than that. I know. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove, and the moment closed, and Rowan went to see how Webb and Thomas were getting on. But the moment had existed. That was the thing about moments. Once they existed, they were permanent. Whatever happened next, that one had already happened. 4 weeks until the hearing. 4 weeks of preparation, of statements and counterstatements, of Webb driving Billings and back twice, of children being interviewed and documents reviewed, and the slow, grinding work of building a case out of truth against a case built out of money and strategy. 4 weeks, and whatever was going to happen was going to happen. But that night, at least, the house was warm, and Thomas's voice carried down the hall in the particular tone of someone saying something they have needed to say for a very long time. And outside the Montana stars were brutal and indifferent and absolutely beautiful, the way things are when they don't care about you at all, and are magnificent regardless. Rowan stood at the kitchen window and looked at them for a moment. Then he went back to work. The morning of the 14th of March arrived with the particular cruelty of early spring in Montana, the kind of day that looks like winter has finally loosened its grip, the sky a pale and cautious blue, the air just cold enough to remind you that warmth is still a promise rather than a fact. The snow had pulled back from the road into dirty gray ridges along the fence lines, and the mud beneath was soft and uncertain, the way ground is when it hasn't yet decided what season to commit to. Rowan was up before first light, not because he'd slept badly, though he had, but because the ranch still needed what it always needed, regardless of what was happening in town, and doing the morning work steadied him in a way that nothing else reliably did. He fed the horses, checked the cattle, split enough wood to last 2 days, and came back inside to find Eliza already at the stove, and the kitchen smelling of coffee, and the particular focused silence of a woman who has been awake longer than she's letting on. She handed him a cup without turning around. The children are still sleeping, she said. Good. He wrapped both hands around the cup. They don't need to be there for the opening. Webb said afternoon, most likely, before any testimony. I know what Webb said. She turned around. She was dressed already. Her better dress again, the same one from the courthouse, which she had pressed the night before with a care that suggested she was doing something with her hands, while her mind was elsewhere. Her hair was up. Her face had the controlled quality he'd come to recognize as her version of armor. Not cold, but composed. Every emotion accounted for and assigned its proper place so none of them could move without permission. She looked, he thought, like someone walking into a fight. They're not sure they can win, but have decided to show up for anyway. You look fine, he said. I look like I slept 3 hours, she said. You look like someone who has things to say and intends to say them. She held his gaze for a moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not the smile, not quite, but the direction of one. The same thing he'd seen twice before. He was beginning to understand that this was what her warmth looked like in its natural state. Brief, unannounced, and entirely genuine. She turned back to the stove. They arrived in Black Ridge by 9 in the morning, Rowan driving the wagon with Eliza beside him and Franklin Webb, who had come out from Billings the previous night and slept on the bunkhouse cot with the stoicism of a man who has slept in worse places in service of difficult cases, sitting in the wagon bed reviewing notes that he had already reviewed approximately 40 times. Thomas rode with them. He had not asked whether he was coming. He had simply appeared at the wagon at the appropriate time. Dressed in his cleanest clothes, his face set with the same decision-made quality it had worn since the evening on the porch. Clara came too, at Webb's request. She was 11, which was young for court testimony, But Webb wanted her available if the questioning of the household's day-to-day ran into specifics that needed corroboration. The younger children stayed at the ranch with Marcus and Pete and Eli, who had been assigned the care of the four youngest, with the ceremonial seriousness of someone given a significant responsibility. Hattie had objected to this strenuously, making the case that she was old enough to go to court and that nobody had asked her opinion on this. Eliza had heard her out, acknowledged the objection formally, and said no. Hattie had then looked at Rowan in appeal, and Rowan had said, "Your mother said no," which was the first time he had explicitly deferred to Eliza in front of the children in a manner they could observe and measure, and something in Thomas's posture on the wagon seat shifted fractionally when he heard it. The Black Ridge courthouse was not large, but it had a courtroom on the upper floor that managed, through high ceilings and tall windows, to produce an atmosphere of institutional gravity that was partly functional and partly deliberate, the kind of room designed to make people feel that what happens here has weight. By the time Rowan and his family arrived, the gallery was already half filled. He had not expected that. He should have, perhaps. Black Ridge was not a city. It was a community of 400 people where the events of January, Gideon's public auction, Rowan's public intervention, had been discussed from every angle for the past 6 weeks. The hearing had not been secret. People had opinions. They had come to watch those opinions resolved. Gideon was already there, seated at the plaintiff's table, with Aldous Crane beside him in a suit that cost more than Rowan's wagon. Gideon wore the expression of a man who is confident in his position and finds the entire proceeding slightly beneath him. The patience of someone who expects to win and is merely waiting for the formality of it to conclude. He looked at Rowan when they entered. A long, measuring look with nothing friendly in it and nothing hostile either. The look of a chess player across a board, assessing pieces. Then he looked at Eliza, and his expression changed in a way that was small and quickly controlled, but not invisible to someone paying attention. It was not the look he gave Rowan. It was the look of a man encountering something that has escaped a category he created for it, and not being entirely sure yet how to reclassify. Eliza did not look at him. She sat down beside Rowan at the defense table with her back straight and her hands folded, and she looked at the empty judge's bench, and she waited. Judge Harlan Price arrived at 10 o'clock. He was exactly as Franklin Webb had described, 63, silver-haired, with the deliberate movements of a man who has understood for some time that the impression of authority matters as much as authority itself. He sat, arranged his papers, and looked out at the courtroom with the expression of someone who has seen every possible variety of human dispute and found them all, at some fundamental level, predictable. Webb had warned Rowan about this. "Don't mistake his manner for indifference," he'd said. "Price watches everything. He just doesn't let you see him watching." The opening was procedural and dull, the way legal openings always are when stripped of their context. Crane presented Gideon's petition with smooth, practiced fluency. The contested household, the hasty marriage, the question of appropriate standing. He used the word welfare frequently and with emphasis, as though repeating it often enough would fill it with the specific content he needed it to contain. Webb was more direct. He laid out the facts of the January agreement, the documentary evidence, the timeline of the family's circumstances at the Hale Ranch versus what they had been under Gideon Mercer's authority. He used numbers where he could, specific dates, specific documented conditions, the school attendance records. He was not eloquent in the way Crane was eloquent. He was precise, which was different and, in Rowan's opinion, more honest. Price listened to both with the same careful, unrevealing attention. The witnesses came in the afternoon. Dr. Haverford was first, a compact man of 45 who spoke with the careful factual modesty of a medical professional, describing what he had observed at the Hale Ranch 6 weeks prior. 6 children in various states of prior nutritional deficiency, the youngest with chilblain damage to both feet consistent with extended cold exposure, all of them showing signs of what he described, clinically, as prolonged stress responses. He described what he had observed at his follow-up visit 2 weeks later. Improvement across all metrics, weight gain in the younger children, the foot injuries healing appropriately. He answered Crane's cross-examination with the same clinical precision, neither elaborating nor retreating, and when Crane suggested that the children's prior condition might have had causes other than Gideon Mercer's household management, the doctor looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard a great deal of creative reframing in his career and remains unimpressed by it. "The pattern of deficiency I observed," he said, "is consistent with prolonged inadequate provision. It is not consistent with a brief period of hardship. These children had been in these conditions for months, not days. Crane let that one go. Miss Aldrin was second. She was 27 and taught at the Black Ridge Schoolhouse with the particular brand of watchful dedication of someone who chose the profession deliberately and considers it a serious one. She described Thomas and Clara when they first appeared at school, withdrawn, watchful, behind their age level in certain areas in ways that she attributed, in her professional judgment, to disrupted educational access. She described them now, engaged, present, Thomas especially showing what she called a quickness that had been waiting for the right conditions. She also said, unprompted, directly to Judge Price, "In 20-some years of teaching children, I have developed a reliable sense of a child who is frightened in their home life. Both of these children were frightened when they arrived. They are not frightened now. That is a significant change, and not one children perform." Crane tried to walk that back on cross-examination. He didn't fully succeed. Then Webb called Thomas. The boy walked to the witness stand with the particular combination of deliberateness and barely contained tension of someone who has prepared for something difficult and is now simply executing the preparation. He was 15, broad in the shoulders, with his mother's directness in his eyes. He sat, was sworn in, and looked at Webb. Webb took him through it carefully, not dramatically, methodically, in the way you excavate something carefully, because the thing you're looking for is fragile. The mill, the work, the hours, the injury to Eli's leg, and what came after. The winter in Gideon's house after their father died, the food and the lack of it, the shoes, January, the square. Thomas answered in sentences, not speeches. He didn't perform. He had apparently understood, from Webb's preparation, that the power of what he was saying lay in its plainness rather than its presentation, and he delivered it plain, the way something true doesn't need decoration. The gallery had gone very quiet. Crane rose for cross-examination with the smooth confidence he'd maintained all day. He was good at this, establishing small doubts, creating alternative narratives, finding the places where a witness's certainty could be made to look like stubbornness. He started with the January arrangement. Wasn't it true that Rowan Hale was a stranger? Wasn't it true that the family had known him less than a day before agreeing to go with him? Yes, Thomas said. And yet your mother agreed. Yes. Doesn't that strike you as impulsive, even reckless? Thomas looked at him. My sister was standing in the snow with no shoes, he said. My mother agreed to go with the only person in 60 who did anything about it. That doesn't seem reckless to me. That seems like the only sensible decision available. A sound moved through the gallery. Not applause, something quieter, more involuntary. The sound of 60 people registering something. Judge Price's expression did not change, but his pen, which had been resting on the bench, moved. Crane shifted his approach. He went after the marriage, the speed of it, the convenience. Wasn't it true that the marriage had been recommended by their attorney for legal purposes? Wasn't it true that the marriage was my mother's choice, Thomas said. Crane paused. I'm sorry? You keep asking questions about it like it was Mr. Hale's decision. It wasn't. My mother decided. She sets the conditions in that house. He paused. That's not something I was told to say. It's what I've watched for 6 weeks. Crane looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man encountering unexpected resistance from a direction he'd assessed as soft. Then he looked at his notes, apparently decided he had gotten what he was going to get from this witness, and sat down. There was a recess of 20 minutes. Rowan found Thomas in the hallway, standing by the window that looked out over the main street of Black Ridge, his arms crossed, and the tension of the last hour still visible in his shoulders. Rowan stood beside him. He didn't say anything immediately. Was that all right? Thomas said. His voice was quieter than it had been in the courtroom, the performance held down. That was more than all right, Rowan said. Thomas looked out the window. He kept asking about you like you were the one running everything, he said. Like my mother was just carried along. I know. That's what he thinks. That's what grandfather thinks too. He paused. That someone's always running things, and it's never her. Your mother, Rowan said, has been running things since before any of us were paying attention. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah. Not agreement exactly. More like recognition. Like hearing something said out loud that has been true for a long time but never verbalized. Yeah, she has. They went back in. Eliza testified last. She walked to the witness stand with the same straight back she'd had since January, since the square. since the day Rowan had first seen her standing behind Gideon's words, like something that refused to be defined by them. She sat, was sworn in, and looked at Webb, and when she spoke her voice was what it always was. Low, direct, without performance. Webb walked her through it gently but thoroughly. The marriage to Daniel, the years under Gideon's roof after he died, the conditions, the work the children did, what the children were allowed and not allowed. She answered everything without drama and without softening it, and the plainness of it had its own particular weight. The way a recitation of facts can be more devastating than an emotional appeal because it asks the listener to do the work of feeling what the facts mean. Then Webb asked her, Mrs. Hale, in your assessment, is the home your children are currently living in a safe one? She looked at Price when she answered. Not at Webb. At the judge. My children sleep through the night, she said. When I was in my father-in-law's house, they didn't sleep through the night. They woke from fear and from hunger and from knowing that what happened to them the next day depended on someone else's mood. She paused. At Mr. Hale's ranch, at our home, they sleep. My youngest runs in the yard. My son asked a grown man a question and received an honest answer. My daughter, who couldn't read, is learning to read. Another pause. That is the assessment of a mother who has lived in both places. I believe the court should give it appropriate weight. The gallery was very quiet. Crane's cross-examination of Eliza lasted 18 minutes and accomplished very little. He tried the marriage angle, the speed, the convenience, the legal motivation. She answered steadily, making the distinction between legally motivated and freely chosen with a clarity that did not leave him much room to reframe. He tried the question of Rowan's character, the isolation, the grief, the impulsive act in the square. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has seen a great deal of deliberate impulsiveness and knows the difference between that and someone doing the only decent thing available. You're describing a man who acted on impulse, she said. What I saw was a man who acted on principle. Those look similar from the outside if you're not paying attention. Crane sat down. The closing arguments were procedural, and the afternoon light was going flat through the high windows when Judge Price finally called for a recess to consider his ruling. He gave no indication of timing. He simply gathered his papers with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything, and left the bench, and the room slowly let out the breath it had been holding for hours. Gideon sat at his table and spoke quietly with Crane. From across the room, his face gave nothing away. He was, Rowan noted, not a man who showed doubt. Whether because he didn't feel it or because he had long ago perfected the concealment of it, there was no reading him from the outside. Eliza sat beside Rowan with her hands folded in her lap. Clara had fallen asleep against her shoulder, somewhere in the last hour, and Eliza had one arm around her and was looking straight ahead at the empty judge's bench. You were good, Rowan said quietly. I said what was true, she said. That's why it was good. She turned her head slightly and looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, in the particular low light of a late afternoon courtroom, with her daughter asleep on her shoulder and the tension of the day still in the air around them, the careful control in her face relaxed by a fraction. Not gone. Never all the way gone. Not yet. But the direction of it was different, softer at the edges. Whatever happens, she said quietly, I want you to know that today, She stopped. She was not good at this particular kind of sentence, he had noticed. The ones that moved towards something she hadn't yet organized into language. Thank you, she said finally, for not making us do this alone. Rowan looked at her. He thought about several things to say. He chose the one that felt true without requiring either of them to be ready for more than they were. You were never going to be alone in this, he said. Not from January. She held his gaze for a moment, and the expression on her face was something he hadn't seen there before. Not the almost smile, not the careful control. Something older and quieter. Something that looked, from a certain angle, like relief. Like a door that has been locked from the inside for a very long time is considering, for the first time, whether it might be safe to try the handle. She looked away. Clara shifted in her sleep. They waited. 40 minutes later, Judge Price returned to the bench. He arranged his papers. He looked out at the courtroom with the same unrevealing attention he had maintained all day. Then he began to speak, and the room went very still. Judge Price spoke for 11 minutes. Rowan counted, without meaning to, the way you count things when the rest of your mind is occupied with something too large to hold all at once. 11 minutes, measured against the silence of a full gallery and the particular quality of attention that a room produces when nobody moves. When 60 people have collectively decided that breathing is something they can manage later. Price began with the legal framework, the settlement document, its validity, the procedural history of the petition. His voice was neither warm nor cold, the voice of a man who considers emotional coloring in a courtroom a form of sloppiness. He worked through the evidentiary record with the methodical attention that Webb had predicted. The medical testimony, the school records, the documented discrepancy between Gideon's characterization of the children's educational access and what the actual records showed. He paused at that point and looked up at Gideon directly and said, "The court takes a dim view of factual misrepresentation in petition documents. The attendance records submitted by the defense contradict the claim in the plaintiff's petition by a margin that cannot be attributed to error." Gideon's face showed nothing. Crane wrote something on his notepad. Price continued. He addressed the question of the marriage, its speed, its circumstances, the legal motivation behind it. He noted that marriages undertaken for practical and legal purposes were not uncommon in frontier territories and did not in themselves constitute irregularity. He noted that the testimony of both the wife and her eldest son had described an arrangement in which the woman's authority over her own household and children was demonstrably intact and exercised. Then he set down his papers and looked out at the courtroom with the expression of a man about to say something he has thought about carefully. This court has heard testimony today from a physician, an educator, 2 adults with direct knowledge of the household in question, and a 15-year-old boy who spoke with more clarity and less self-interest than most adult witnesses I have encountered in 20 years on this bench. He paused. The petition before this court rests on the argument that the welfare of 6 children is in question in their current home. The evidence does not support that argument. The evidence supports the opposite conclusion. He looked at Gideon. The court finds for the defendant on all counts. The settlement agreement of January 14th is confirmed as legally valid and binding. The marriage of Rowan Hale and Eliza Mercer is recognized by this court as conferring full legal standing on both parties with respect to the minor children. The petition's request for custody review is denied. The plaintiff's request for visitation rights is denied on the grounds that the testimony presented today establishes a pattern of conduct toward these children that does not serve their welfare. He picked up his papers. The plaintiff is advised that any future legal action against this household that is not supported by substantially stronger evidence than was presented today will be regarded by this court as harassment and treated accordingly. He looked at Gideon one more time, and the look was not long, but it was specific. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down. For a half second the room held its silence, and then it released, not into noise exactly, but into the sound of people moving, exhaling, turning to each other. The collective physical expression of tension finding its exit. Webb's hand came down on the table in a single firm, flat slap of satisfaction, the gesture of a man who does not celebrate loudly but allows himself one physical expression of a fight concluded. Rowan sat very still. Beside him, Eliza had not moved. She was looking at the bench where Price had been, her hands still folded in her lap, Clara still drowsing against her shoulder despite the noise. Then Clara stirred and sat up, blinking, and looked at her mother's face and apparently read what was in it, because she sat up straighter and looked at the room with wide eyes. "Did we?" Clara started. "Yes," Eliza said. Thomas, on Rowan's other side, let out a breath through his nose. A long, quiet exhalation, not a word, but the sound of something that has been held very tightly for a very long time being allowed to unclench. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands over his face, and his shoulders shook once, quickly, and then he straightened and put his hands down and looked straight ahead, jaw set, eyes bright. Rowan looked at him. He didn't say anything. He put one hand briefly on the boy's shoulder, not pressing, just present, and Thomas didn't move away from it. Across the room, Gideon Mercer sat at his table while Crane gathered papers with the efficient composure of a professional accustomed to losing and moving on. Gideon himself was motionless. He was looking at nothing in particular, at the middle space of the room, at some interior calculation Rowan couldn't read. His face had not broken. He was not the kind of man whose face broke. But something had gone out of it, some quality of anticipation that had been there all day, and what remained was an older, harder stillness. He stood, eventually, put on his coat. He looked across the room, and his eyes found Rowan's, and they held for a moment, the last of whatever that exchange was, the last time they would face each other across a contested space with the outcome undecided. Then his eyes moved to Eliza. She met his gaze directly. She did not look away. She did not perform anything. No triumph, no contempt, no relief performed for his benefit. She simply looked back at him with the steady, undefeated look of a woman who has outlasted something she was told she couldn't outlast. Gideon Mercer put on his hat, turned, and walked out of the courthouse. He left Black Ridge within a week. Crane filed no further actions. The mill was left in the hands of a manager, the land holdings placed with an agent in Billings. Whether he went east or further west, no one in Black Ridge could say with certainty, and over the years the uncertainty became irrelevance, which is its own kind of verdict. He simply ceased to be the thing they were moving against, that changed something. Not immediately. Grief and fear and long habit don't dissolve the morning after a court victory, and everyone in that family understood, in their different ways, that what they were building was a project of years rather than a moment. But the absence of the immediate threat created a kind of space that hadn't existed since January, a gap in the landscape where something oppressive had been, and into that gap, slowly and with the characteristic stubbornness of things that grow in difficult conditions, other things began to fill in. Spring arrived in Montana the way it always does, reluctantly and with false starts. 3 days of warmth followed by a killing frost, mud everywhere, the creek breaking up with a sound like distant artillery in the early mornings. The ranch woke up with the season. The cattle came through winter better than expected, the calf count was good, and Rowan found himself doing the feed calculations with Pete and actually talking through the numbers rather than performing the motion of talking while thinking about something else. Thomas worked the ranch that spring with a focus and a competence that had been building all winter, and somewhere in March it crossed a threshold and became something identifiable as pride. Not the showy kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that comes from doing a thing well enough that you stop needing to think about how you're doing it and can just do it. He turned 15 in April, and Rowan gave him the use of a good horse and his own set of tack, and Thomas received this with less than a sentence of acknowledgement, and then spent an hour in the barn making sure every piece of the tack was properly cleaned and hung, which was acknowledgement enough. Eli's relationship with horses had by spring deepened into something that Marcus described, with characteristic understatement, as a gift. The gray mare Patience, who had been the source of multiple minor injuries over the years, and whom Pete referred to as a personal grievance with legs, had become Eli's willing collaborator, following him around the paddock with the devotion of a different animal entirely. Marcus was teaching him to identify lameness, to assess conformation, to understand what a horse was telling you with its body language. Eli absorbed it all with the intensity of someone who has found the specific thing the world has for them. His leg still dragged on the left side. It would always drag. But in the saddle, that asymmetry disappeared. Up on a horse, Eli was just a boy with soft hands and a natural seat, and the relief of that seemed to sit somewhere in him that the limp couldn't touch. Clara began teaching Annie to read in the evenings, an arrangement that started practically and became, within weeks, a kind of vocation for Clara. She had the particular patience and inventiveness of a born teacher, finding 30 different ways to explain the same thing until one of them worked, never losing her temper at the 20th attempt. Miss Aldrin, when Clara came back to school after the hearing, told her quietly that if she kept at it, she'd make a fine teacher herself one day. Clara wrote this down in the small notebook she'd started keeping and underlined it twice. Rose, 9 years old and the quietest of the 6, had been the hardest to read all winter. She existed in the household with a kind of careful invisibility, always present, never demanding anything, doing her share, and then some without being asked, the child who gets missed in the accounting because she creates no friction. Eliza watched her with a worried attention she tried not to show too directly, understanding that this kind of quiet in a child is often the most expensive kind. It was Pete Doyle, of all people, who cracked it open. He had found Rose sitting behind the barn one afternoon in April, not crying, just sitting with her knees pulled up and the particular quality of presence that is almost absence. Pete was 22 and not sophisticated about most things, But he had three younger sisters, and some instinct about the particular unhappiness of children who have learned not to ask for anything. He sat down beside her in the dirt without preamble. "What's wrong?" Rose looked at him. "Nothing." "Okay," he said. They sat there for a minute, then, "You know what I do when nothing's wrong?" She looked at him sideways. "I go find something to do that's sort of pointless," he said. "Like skipping rocks." "You want to go skip rocks?" She looked at him for a long moment with the assessing eyes of a child deciding whether an adult is trustworthy. Then she stood up and said, "The creek's still too icy." "Probably," Pete said. "We can look, though." The creek was, in fact, still mostly frozen at the edges, but there was a stretch in the middle that had opened up, and they spent an hour at it, Pete skipping rocks with more enthusiasm than skill, while Rose, who turned out to have an excellent natural technique, quietly outperformed him by a significant margin. She didn't talk about whatever was behind the barn. She didn't need to, as it turned out. She just needed to be somewhere for an hour where nothing was required of her, and Pete had the good sense to provide that without turning it into a conversation about feelings. She came back to the house with mud on her boots, and a color in her face that Eliza noticed immediately and said nothing about, because she was smart enough to know that some things are best left to settle on their own. Hattie, it must be said, had needed no particular intervention. Hattie had decided in approximately the first week that this was her home, and these were her people, and she had opinions about how everything should be managed, and she communicated these opinions with the unstoppable confidence of someone who has never been convinced that her perspective is less valid than anyone else's. She had adopted Pete as her personal assistant. She had decided that Marcus was secretly very funny, which Marcus found baffling and did not discourage. She had also, sometime in March, begun referring to Rowan simply as Rowan, not Pa, not Mr. Hale, just Rowan, with the familiarity of someone who has evaluated all available terminology and determined that this one fits. "Rowan," she said one morning in late April, appearing at his elbow at the breakfast table with the sudden materialization she had apparently perfected. "Marcus said there are baby horses coming." "Foals," Rowan said. "2 mares are due in May. I want to name one." "We'll see." "That means no," Hattie said. "It means we'll see." She looked at him with those enormous eyes, calculating. "What if I named it something very good?" "Then we'd have a foal with a very good name, and you could feel proud about that," Rowan said. She considered the logistics of this for a moment. "I want to name it Patience the Second." From the other end of the table, Eli looked up from his food with an expression of genuine alarm. Eliza pressed her hand briefly over her mouth. "Eli has some thoughts about that," Rowan said. "She's my horse," Eli said, pointing his fork at Hattie, with a firmness that was somewhat undermined by the fact that he was visibly trying not to smile. "She's Mr. Hale's horse," Hattie said. "Rowan lets me ride her." "I could ride her too." "You can't reach the stirrups." "I would if they were adjusted." "Enough," Eliza said, with the practiced precision of a woman who has been managing this category of argument for several months and has developed excellent timing. The table settled. Outside, the April sun was doing its best through the kitchen window, which at this hour hit the table at a low angle and made everything look warmer than it was. Rowan looked down the table at all of it, at Thomas eating with the focused efficiency of a boy who is always slightly hungry from actual physical labor, at Eli still composing a response to Hattie that he would probably not deliver, at Clara with her notebook out even at breakfast, at Rose passing the bread to Annie with a quiet attentiveness that was its own kind of healing made visible, at Hattie, who had moved on from the horse argument and was now applying butter to her biscuit with the concentration of a small engineer, and at Eliza, at the other end of the table, who was pouring coffee and saying something low to Sam about keeping his elbows down, and who looked up at that moment and caught Rowan looking, and held his gaze across the length of the table in the noise and the ordinary chaos of a family morning. She didn't look away. He didn't either. Something passed between them that didn't have a name yet, or rather had several possible names, and neither of them was in a hurry to choose. They had been married for 6 weeks. They had been cautious with each other in the way of two people who have been hurt by carelessness, and have decided, independently, that slowness is not weakness. They had shared a table in a difficult fight and a long winter, and they had learned, in the way you learn someone when you're living in close proximity to them, without the performance of courtship, the real shape of each other, the flaws and the strengths, and the particular ways that each of them was imperfect that the other had begun, without quite deciding to accommodate. She turned back to the coffee. He turned back to his breakfast. But something had shifted again, as things kept shifting between them. Not dramatically, not with announcement. Just the slow, patient accumulation of a feeling that is becoming too large for the space you've been keeping it in. That evening, after the children were in bed and Marcus and Pete had gone out, Rowan was on the porch with the last of the day's light going bronze over the foothills when Eliza came out and stood beside him. She had her shawl wrapped around her against the April chill, which was still real even when the days were finally showing signs of something other than winter. They stood there for a while without speaking, which was not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of two people who are, for the moment, content to exist in the same place. "I've been thinking," Eliza said. "About what?" She looked out at the hills. "About the conditions," she said, "the ones we wrote down." He was still. "The one that says, if the legal situation resolves, we revisit the arrangement." She paused. "Together." That was the word. "I remember," he said. "The legal situation has resolved," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the horizon, her profile clear against the deepening sky, her expression not closed, something more open than he had seen it, something that had stopped defending itself quite so thoroughly against the possibility of being seen. "Yes," he said. "It has." "So," she said. A long pause. "I'm revisiting." He waited. "I don't want—" She stopped. "I'm not good at this," she said, plainly, without apology. "Neither am I," he said. She looked at him then, turned her head and looked at him directly the way she had a handful of times. The way that felt each time like something being offered rather than something withheld. "I know you're not Daniel," she said. "I have known that for a long time. I needed more time to know what that meant for me. What it was safe to—" She stopped again. "I'm not frightened of you," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm frightened of myself a little, of getting it wrong again." "That's a reasonable fear," he said. "You're not going to tell me it'll be fine." I don't know that it'll be fine," he said. "I know I'll try not to waste what you're—" He paused. "I know I'll try." She looked at him for a moment with something in her face that was very honest and not entirely comfortable, the way real things often aren't comfortable. Then she reached out and took his hand, not dramatically, just reached out and took it, and held it, and looked back at the hills. His hand closed around hers. They stood there while the light went and the first stars appeared over the Montana foothills. The same stars that had been there all winter over all of this. Over the square in January. Over the frozen road. Over the courtroom and the long weeks of waiting and the small daily accumulations of a life being rebuilt from what it had been into something neither of them had planned, and both of them were beginning to want. It was not the end of difficult things. Nothing is ever the end of difficult things. Thomas would have hard years ahead of him, as young men do, and there would be arguments and seasons of doubt, and mornings when the ranch felt like a burden, and evenings when old grief came back without warning. Eliza would not become someone who found trust easy. It would always cost her something, always require the specific choice of it rather than the automatic assumption. Rowan would carry Catherine with him for the rest of his life, which was right, and which Eliza understood, and there would be moments when that weight was visible and needed to be acknowledged rather than explained away. These were not failures. They were the actual texture of a life shared between people who came to each other from hard places and decided, against reasonable odds, to try anyway. The foals came in May. 2 of them, both healthy, both immediately the subject of naming controversy. Hattie got her way on one of them, eventually, through a campaign of attrition so comprehensive that even Eli conceded in the end. The foal was not named Patience II. It was named, after lengthy negotiation, Hattie's Choice, which was a compromise that satisfied no one and somehow pleased everyone. Thomas turned 16 in July and asked, that fall, whether there was any possibility of attending the school in Billings that Franklin Webb had mentioned. Rowan and Eliza sat across a table and talked about it together for 2 evenings, going back and forth, neither of them pretending to have the only right answer, and in the end they sent him with enough money for the year and a horse that was his. And he came back at Christmas changed, in the way that learning changes people, larger in certain ways, certain in others, thoroughly himself. Eli stayed with the horses. He was good enough by the time he was 17 that a rancher from 2 counties over offered to buy his training services. He accepted, negotiated his own terms. Eliza had taught him that much. And began building something that was entirely his own, Clara did become a teacher. She went back to Black Ridge and eventually ran the schoolhouse that had seen her arrive as a frightened, watchful girl and watched her leave as someone who had found her purpose inside that same building. She was not always patient. She was always fair. Her students understood the difference. The ranch grew slowly, the way real things grow. Not through dramatic expansion, but through consistent, unglamorous work that compounds over years. More cattle, a second-hand hired, a proper second bedroom eventually built onto the house with timber that Eli helped select. The place acquired, gradually, the quality of somewhere that has been lived in with intention. Not fine, not showy, but solid in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the specific accumulation of people choosing it daily. Rowan and Eliza were not a simple love story. They were something more honest than that. Two people who came together from wreckage and built something with the materials at hand, which were imperfect and sufficient. They argued sometimes the way people argue when they both have strong opinions, and neither has learned to be entirely comfortable with being wrong. They had bad seasons and good ones. There were nights when the distance between them felt larger than the length of a house, and mornings when it felt like nothing at all. But they kept choosing. That was the thing. They kept choosing each other the way you choose a path, not because it's easy, but because it's yours. Because you've put enough of yourself into it, that turning back would mean losing something you don't want to lose. Rowan visited Catherine's grave still, most mornings, as he always had. He went alone, early, before the house woke up. He stood under the old pine and was quiet. Over the years, the nature of those visits changed. Less the desperate proximity of the grief-struck, and more the comfortable quiet of a man who carries someone with him and doesn't need to explain it to anyone, least of all himself. Catherine had known him when he was a different person. She had been part of making him who he was now. That was not something to be put away. It was something to be carried correctly. Eliza knew about the visits. She had never asked him to stop. She had simply, one morning in the second year, asked if she could come once. He had said yes. They had stood there together under the pine, not speaking, and she had looked at the two graves and looked at him and taken his hand the same way she had on the porch that April evening. Simply, without drama, the gesture of someone who knows that sharing grief is not the same as competing with it. Years later, when Hattie was old enough to ask the question, children eventually ask, "How did you and Papa come to be?" Eliza thought about how to answer it. She thought about the square in January, about the snow and the silence, and a man she didn't know who looked at her daughter's bleeding feet and decided that was enough of a reason. She thought about the careful, fractured months that followed, the legal fight, the kitchen table negotiations, the slow and unromantic and entirely real accumulation of a trust that had been built from nothing, because nothing was what they'd both had to start with. She told Hattie the true version, not softened, not simplified, the whole thing. Hattie, who was by then a grown woman with her mother's eyes and her own particular version of her mother's stubbornness, listened to all of it and said, "So he saw my feet and decided to do something about it." "Yes," Eliza said, "and then you built the rest." "We built the rest," Eliza said, "together. It took a while." Hattie thought about this. "That's a good story," she said. "It's a true one," Eliza said, and that in the end was the thing that held. Not perfection, not the clean arc of a story told to be admired, but the uneven, deliberate, frequently difficult truth of people who chose to keep going when stopping would have been easier. The family forged in a January courtyard under a mean Montana sky. Not from love at first sight, or fate, or any of the comfortable explanations, but from one person looking at a hard thing and deciding not to walk away from it, and then deciding again the next day, and the day after that, until the deciding became simply home.